Thank you very much. Really appreciate it. Thank you. Great room. Appreciate it. I am delighted to be here. Thanks, Skip. Really appreciate it. I've been looking forward to this for a long time. I'll tell you, I jumped at the opportunity to be here. I always feel like when I get back to Little Rock, because I worked in the Clinton White House, feels like a bit of a homecoming. Right, Stephanie? I love attending events like this as well. Wherever I've traveled around the world, I enjoy actually participating in events like this because I think it represents the best of citizen scholarship, people simply coming together to learn for the sake of learning. We do this for our kids a lot, but not as much for adults, so I really appreciate this. Now, I will say that, truth is, I'm a little scared to be talking in front of real live people. I don't get to do that very often. Doing television is very different. The studio is sort of this dark place. They keep it cool because of all the cameras and everything. There's a couple of guys walking around with duct tape stuck all over them telling you when you're live on the camera and when you're not. And it's funny, they're supposed to tell you, they kind of literally wave to the camera when you're now live and broadcasting, but they don't always remember. Sometimes they forget to do that. And there was one time, there was this birthday celebration for one of our producers, and I was anchoring a live show, and in one of the commercial breaks, they came down and brought a piece of cake. So we were sitting there eating a piece of cake, and certainly everyone got into it. They forgot to tell us that we were back live, came back, and I literally had a piece of cake in my mouth. Made even worse, no lie, by the fact that the segment was on childhood obesity. The Alliance people would have loved that, I'm sure. Now, while the studio is nice and cool and quiet, all the activities happening in a control room that's a couple floors away usually. And the control room is kind of an amazing place. All these producers and directors sitting in a room. There's all these monitors across the top where people are trying to figure out what all the other networks are doing and queuing video and pulling video and all this sort of stuff. And you, in the studio, you wear this little earpiece so that people, dozens of people in the control room, can talk to you while you're trying to talk. And I think this was the hardest thing to get used to when I first started in television. You're in the middle of an interview or something, and someone suddenly will key in and start talking to you. And in my case, when I first started, it was often, I'd be in the middle of an interview, and I'd hear the little thing open up, and they would say, "You look too serious. You should smile more," or something like that. Or a little while later, "What are you grinning at?" It's a funny business, medicine and media. One of the other things I always tell you is more energy. More energy. So if you see people gesticulating wildly on camera for seemingly no reason, now you know why. I was once doing an interview actually with former President Clinton, and it was a live interview, and I'll never forget this. It's one of the funniest stories. I was driving to the interview. It was in New York, and on the way there I called my wife, and I said, "I'm going to do this interview," and her first question was, "What tie are you wearing?" I told her what tie I was wearing, and she said, "You always wear that tie. You have to get a different tie." And I said, I'm driving to the interview. I can't get a new tie right now. And as I was saying this, we literally drove by this store called the Tie Store. So I said, well, this is fate. I should stop. I went inside and I bought a tie. And so I wore this new tie. I was very excited. I walk in, and the president comes in. We're sitting there all ready. The president comes in. He looks at me, and the first thing he says is, "That's a great tie." So I said, "Well, thank you." So in the meantime, I got my earpiece in, and they're telling me a couple minutes before we come back at a commercial break. So I'm telling the president about the story, about how my wife told me to get this tie, and he was interested, and then he goes, "How many days a week do you do television?" I said, "Yeah, about 6 days." He goes, "You don't really want people to have you wearing the same tie twice." I said, "Yeah, right." And the guy's in my ear going, 1 minute back now. And he goes, "So 6 days, so how many ties would you need to people not know?" And he's literally going like this. And in my ear, they're going 30 seconds. And he's like, 12. And then right before the director says, "We're back live," the president says, 14 ties, and make sure you get plenty of shirts to go and mix and match it up. Never forget that. I love that story. As Skip mentioned, I've been living at the sort of interesting intersection of medicine and media for some time, and it's a fascinating place. It's an awkward dance sometimes between medicine and media, and I think in many ways my roots to how I got there may be similar to some of the other people in this room. I had a chance when I was in college and then in an early part of medical school to start writing on a topic that was of great interest to me. I was very interested in healthcare policy. I was very interested in how we define ourselves as a nation by our health, in terms of how we take care of each other. And I just thought that was something that everyone should be engaged in, certainly people within the healthcare community, but everybody outside the healthcare community as well. And at the same time, the grand rounds in our hospitals, the teaching rounds, while they were appropriately filled with discussions about brain tumor biology and fusing spines and how to clip aneurysms, in my case as a neurosurgeon, a lot of the sidebar discussions started becoming about the future of healthcare, about federal entitlements, about all these issues that would define us, again, as a nation. And there hadn't really been meaningful healthcare reform at that point in our country in a quarter century. So that was just fascinating to me, and I decided as a person in the field that I should start trying to contribute to the discussion. I should start writing about it as much as I could. And it's funny, because when I was preparing the speech, I went back and looked at some of that writing, and first thing that came to my mind was just how bad my writing was. It's amazing when you're in your 20s, early 20s, late teens, you're so full of dogma and hubris and confidence, and then you go back and look at it, and I'm a pack rat, and I keep all this stuff. And now, as I've gone back and looked at a lot of the television that I started doing when I first started 12 years ago, and that is equally bad as well. And it's memorialized forever. People can pull this stuff up. But when I started doing television, it was about this idea of being able to contribute to this discussion on healthcare. And it was also, for me personally, this idea of just starting a brand new skill set in life. And I think it was one of those things where I'd learned so much about how the brain, you could think of it as a muscle, but even more appropriately, it was a series of muscles. And I wanted to train these different muscles, and simply just trying something new, in this case broadcast television, would help me do that. And you get all kinds of advice when you start. Again, people whispering in your ear and all that sort of stuff. I remember one of the best pieces of advice I got was literally, they said, be self-deprecating. It's always funny when someone gives you that advice, be self-deprecating. Do you make fun of yourself because it's true or because it's funny? I wasn't sure which. But I remember I went home and I told my wife, I said, they said I should be more self-deprecating. And she immediately nodded, yes, you should be more self-deprecating. So I was preparing the speech. She said, you should tell a joke about neurosurgeons during your speech. To which I replied, there are no jokes about neurosurgeons. I guess kind of making her point for her. And she said, I will find you one. So here goes. I'm going to tell you this joke here. A man is very sick in the hospital, and the doctor comes out to talk to the family and says, look, your loved one's very ill. We think the only thing that's really going to help him is to do a brain transplant. Family's understandably confused. Brain transplant, you do those? So yeah, we started doing those a while ago, and the bad news is they're very expensive, and insurance doesn't cover them. So, well, how much is it? It says it's $500,000 for a male brain, and $250,000 for a female brain. And all the men in the family nodded as if this was the most obvious thing they'd ever heard. And finally, one young woman spoke up and she said, well, hang on a second, doctor. How come it's so much cheaper for a female brain? And without missing a beat, the doctor said, well, that's easy. They're discounted for having been previously used. So, yeah, you thought that was going the other way. I know. My wife says she's going to tell a joke about neurosurgeons, and she tells a joke about all men instead. But as I said, my roots, I think, are similar maybe to a lot of people in this room. I was a White House fellow, as Skip mentioned, in 97, 98. And I worked in a particularly unique office at that time. It was an office that was focused on commemorating the millennium, the White House Millennium Office. And it was really interesting because when you work in an office like that at that time in our history, it sort of forces you to reflect on the traditions in this country that we found important, and the traditions that we hope generations from now people would find important as well. And we called it to honor the past and imagine the future. And I loved that. I thought that was so interesting. We tackled everything from science with Stephen Hawking to jazz with Wynton Marsalis. We did one of the first White House internet chats, 1997. True story. We were so clever, we thought back then. By the way, a lot of people confuse the Millennium Project with the Y2K project. You remember this? This was a big deal back in the late 90s. A lot of people concerned about what would happen to our computers. And it was interesting because there was so much confusion. I started to learn as much as I could about Y2K because inevitably people would ask me about this. And there were two main concerns with Y2K surrounding digital and data storage. Part of the problem was that the convention at the time that we started storing our things digitally, we only used 2 digits for the year. So when we got to the year 2000, that was going to pose an obvious problem. Although, in retrospect, our lack of faith that those digital storage systems would actually last to the year 2000, I think was even a bigger problem. The other issue that I found really fascinating, and I love to tell this story, is despite the fact that we were creating these incredible paradigms for how we were going to store information for hospitals, for businesses, for universities, we were relying on these very complicated algorithms, but despite all that, we weren't sure, a lot of people weren't sure when they did this, whether the year 2000 was in fact a leap year. Do you know this? It's really interesting. Turns out that the Earth does not actually revolve around the sun in 365 days. It's 365 and a quarter days, which is why every 4 years there's a leap year. So you can see how you just simply add a day every 4 years. The year 1992 would be a leap year. It's divisible by 4. The year 1996 would be a leap year. You get it. But the problem is that it's not actually 365 and a quarter days. It's not actually 365 and 6 hours. It's actually 365.2425 days. Stick with me on this. It's really interesting. So it's not actually 365 days and 6 hours. But for the Earth to revolve around the sun, it's 365 days, 5 hours, and 49 minutes. So they needed to create these leap years, but then they needed to take away some leap years. So what they did was they said if the year is divisible by 100, it's not a leap year. So the year 1800, the year 1900, those would not be leap years. But they did one more thing when they were creating the Gregorian calendar, and they said if the year is also divisible by 400, it is then again a leap year. So the year 2000 was a leap year. Divisible by 4, not divisible by 100, but divisible by 400. And that simple fact was almost the genesis of a huge worldwide computer calamity. It's amazing stuff. But I'll tell you, working at the White House taught me so many things. Leadership at that level of government, the executive branch of government, trying in your heart to see all sides of an issue. The importance of the smallest details. And something that I think the First Lady really taught me, the value of story, how to really be able to thread stories through this. I remember one of the first, I used to write some speeches for her that were related to healthcare, and I remember one of the first speeches I wrote for the First Lady revolved specifically around children's health, and this particular one was around environmentally induced asthma. It was something she was very interested in. And I'll tell you, I spent weeks on this speech. And I was somebody who, as a physician and someone who spent a lot of time on the scientific method and really trying to understand the significance of certain data, I had that stuff really locked down. I made sure that I got that absolutely right. And as we got closer and closer to the event, we had some time to actually talk through this a little bit, and I showed her a draft of the speech. And I was nervous, and I remember her looking at it, and she was asking some really good questions, some tough questions. They were actually really hard questions. I felt like I was going through oral boards, to be quite honest. And I was amazed and stunned at how much she already knew about this particular topic. And then she turned to me. I'll never forget this, because I think in some ways it laid the framework for how I think about a lot of my reporting today. She turned and looked at me and said, "How do you suppose a child feels when they're going through an asthma attack?" I thought that was such an interesting question. It was really brilliant, in fact. I spent hours thinking about it. I called up my girlfriend at 2 a.m. She's now my wife. And asked her opinion. I said, what does a child feel like when they're going through an asthma attack? Was it fright? Was it anger? Was it desperation? A child going through an asthma attack, at first, suddenly going from normal breathing, the very first thing you do when you enter the world, and now that's taken away from you as a child, no longer normal. And it feels like you're breathing through a straw. And what I came up with was this idea that it was confusion. The child feels confused by it. They don't fully understand it, and that subsequently leads to a series of other emotions. Confusion is the first thing they would feel. And once you start to really understand something like that, truly put yourself into someone else's shoes, and really fundamentally understand what they're going through, it changes everything. It changes the way you write, a speech in this case, a story now for a magazine or for television stories that I do. It just really, for just a few minutes even, really trying to fully understand that. And I think also the important point is while you may have a really good message, when you can fully describe how someone's feeling, it gets people to understand the emotion of the situation and gets them to care. I think public health, when we talk about doing public health on television, those are the two important ingredients. You have to actually take a message, make sure it's the right message, make sure it's a well-sourced message, and it's as accurate as it possibly can be, and then you got to make sure as many people as possible listen to it. And that really got to me. I mean, I think that was something the First Lady really imparted on me, the President imparted on me as we worked on speeches throughout that year, and I thought that was really, really fascinating. And I think this intersection between medicine and media, which is still a relatively new one, is in many ways meant to be a public health role. That's how I think about it. You craft the right messages, you make sure they're full of substance, and then you want as many people to listen as possible. And when I started really thinking about this, after spending time at the White House, I thought, why did I get interested in healthcare? Why did I get interested in medicine? My parents are not physicians. They were both engineers, very different sort of upbringing than a lot of children who go into medicine. But it became very personal for me when my own mother was diagnosed with breast cancer. And I remember, first of all, going through all the emotions that a loved one would go through when you hear that someone's been diagnosed with cancer. And again, it caused you to sort of reflect and try and understand what would she be feeling in so many ways. My mom, my parents, I'm of Indian descent. My parents came from the other side of the world to be here in this country. My mom was actually the first woman ever hired as an engineer at the Ford Motor Company. Just a remarkable woman. She went to Oklahoma for college, and then she graduated an engineering degree and decided she'd go to Michigan because that's where the jobs were at that time. Just drove cross country. And it's a sort of a remarkable story. She was driving through Ann Arbor, Michigan, and her car broke down. Car breaks down. So if you're an immigrant from the other side of the world and you have no money, no friends, no contacts really whatsoever, very little money, and your car breaks down, what do? Mid-1960s. You go to a phone booth, which is what she did. They had phone booths back then. And she decided to call a random name in the phone book. She found an Indian-sounding name because that was the culture, and she just decided to call this person. And she called, and the person she was calling did not answer, but his roommate did, her future husband, my father. You can't make this stuff up. And he comes down. My dad was also an engineer, so this was the perfect damsel in distress story. Comes down, he's anxious to help out. He still talks about it. It was a 64 red Nova. Yes, Dad, I've heard the story 100 times. He said, I love that car. And I said, well, you love the woman driving it even more, as it turns out. But we recounted a lot of these stories when my mom got sick, when she was diagnosed, and she obviously immediately thought to fight hard about this. The treatment was grueling, operations, chemo, radiations, and suddenly she was in the midst of this unbelievably quick education into the world of healthcare. And I remember one of the things she said to me is that she blamed herself for getting cancer. And I thought that was such a striking and unpredictable thing. I could not understand why she would blame herself for getting cancer. But again, it goes back to this notion of truly understanding where people are coming from and recognizing how that's possibly driving a lot of the ways that they think about this. My mom's doing great. She's doing fine. She recovered. I'm going to see her, I think, tomorrow. So it's, we're thrilled about that. But we went through a sort of healthcare education together, and I think in many ways it started to inform how I would think about healthcare in the future. Now, as you might imagine, there's been a lot of news about healthcare in the last couple of years, and there's going to be a lot more in the years to come. I've followed, as a medical reporter working for a big news organization, I followed what's happening with the Affordable Care Act closer than most. And as I did that, I thought about my mom. I thought about a lot of my own patients, and I was curious what it would mean to patients like her and the physicians also that cared for her. Now, most of you probably have some idea of what the Affordable Care Act is all about. But it's tough. It's over 2,000 pages long. I've read it twice, which is probably 2 times more than most of Congress did. But the thing that comes up a lot, sorry if there was any, the thing that comes up a lot is this idea of not discriminating against people based on pre-existing conditions. So if you're already sick, you shouldn't be discriminated against because you've had this illness in the past. And that seems like such a fundamental thing to me. I mean, you're providing health care. How do you discriminate against people who need it the most? I just never fully understood that. But there's a sort of specific, little-known principle to explain why this isn't just a good idea, but actually fundamentally necessary for this Affordable Care Act and healthcare really to work at all. There are tens of millions of people without healthcare insurance. We know that. And you probably have a pretty good idea who they are. There are some who simply cannot afford it. Some choose not to have it, convinced that they're immortal in some way. But the group that surprises people the most is that about 1 in 7 people who applied for healthcare insurance, they were rejected. They couldn't get it. They could not buy healthcare insurance at any price. So they wanted it, they were willing to pay for it, and they could not get it at any price. And this is what's become so important about the psychological aspects of actually implementing something like the Affordable Care Act. Why would that be, that you could not offer healthcare insurance at any particular price? Surely there must be a price for which it would make sense for the healthcare insurance company to provide that insurance. They could simply charge more, you would say. So as you start to work through this, it becomes really fascinating. These are people who are already sick. That makes sense. They have pre-existing conditions. They are going to probably cost more money, and that's going to be an alarm bell for an insurance company. You get that. But again, why not any price? Could you not buy it at a price that would be higher rate than healthy people, for example, a rate that would protect the insurance company from the higher costs? Well, the basic thesis is that people who are healthy don't really participate in the healthcare system. They don't really know how much healthcare costs. They're sort of insulated in many ways from these costs. Whereas chronically ill people, they tend to know just about everything about the cost of their healthcare. They are sick, but they are educated as well about healthcare. And in large part, it's because of that education, that quote-unquote inside information, that makes them such a difficult patient, potentially, for insurance companies. So take an example. You got a man in his mid-40s who is suddenly afflicted with some sort of disease, cancer, for example, and he's likely to weigh the odds of an aggressive treatment versus the anguish of getting all those treatments. Whereas somebody who's been sick for a long time, who's had cancer for a long time, they may be trying to obtain healthcare insurance, and they have a greater appreciation for what the treatment options are, what the costs are going to be, and they presumably have a clearer sense of how much they're willing to pay for survival, what they're willing to give up. Now, what's important and what makes healthcare so different than any other market, I think this is the most fundamental point, is that different people are going to reach vastly different conclusions with the same illness. Some people are going to say, I'm going to go for it, I'm going to try everything, and some people are not. And that makes it very difficult to predict what the costs are going to be for any given individual. It becomes very hard to generalize. So the insurance company wants to offer coverage, let's say to cancer patients. They can look at statistics across the board and figure out what the coverage to offer is and how much that's going to cost. But since these patients are going to choose different options, how do you know if you should charge, $8,000 for one person, $10,000 for somebody else? How do you make sense of it all? So if you just play this out and you say the insurance company decides to engage, and they say, okay, we figure it's going to cost about, we're just going to guess high. We're going to say the policy's $10,000 because on average it's going to cost about $8,000 to take care of some of the sickest patients within the program. Now, which patient is going to take them up on their offer? The patients who know how much their health care is going to cost, and they say, look, it's going to cost about $8,000 for my health care. You're charging me $10,000 for a premium. I'm not going to do that. They will never do that. So all of a sudden, they are only going to engage with the insurance company when they feel like they can actually get some benefit from buying that insurance premium. You sort of see where this is going. So the average cost may be $8,000, but the only ones who are going to sign up are the ones who expect their cost to be greater than $10,000, the cost of the premium. And let's say the insurance company says, you know what, I'll charge $20,000 instead. I'll just make this even more expensive, $20,000. Well, for them, that could actually make the problem even worse. Because now people who would buy into the healthcare insurance program at a cheaper price, they're not going to do it at all now. And the people who actually understand healthcare costs are only going to do it if their healthcare costs are over $20,000. So I bring this up because when we talk about not discriminating on pre-existing conditions, it isn't something that just pragmatically, medically makes sense. But from a moral standpoint, it's almost necessary. Otherwise, there's always going to be discrimination, and it's going to be preferentially targeted at those people who are sick and who are educated. And I just found that really unconscionable. There's a lot of layers to the Affordable Care Act. There's a lot of layers to getting healthcare reform done overall. But there's the nuance of this, I think, is so important as you try to explain these decisions. By the way, the concept that I'm describing is something known as adverse selection. And it's not a new concept. People actually won the Nobel Prize for this in the 1970s for being able to use this to describe why all sorts of people make decisions in different markets. But healthcare in particular was so unique. There is one way to be healthy, but lots of different ways to be sick in terms of how people are going to react. It's a startling concept, but again, I think really important to understand. I started writing about these sorts of concepts some 20 years ago now, and I found them interesting then. When I worked at the White House, I was very interested in healthcare, and again, had a chance to start writing about this. And when I started at CNN in the summer of 2001, I thought that's what I was going to be doing. I was going to continue to practice medicine, and then on the side, be able to talk about healthcare policy and be able to move the country forward in terms of its understanding of healthcare policy. I started in August of 2001, and 3.5 weeks after I started, the attacks of 9/11 happened. And all of a sudden, our worlds were just, everybody's world was going off in different directions. Over the next several years, I would be covering the anthrax attacks. I was in Afghanistan. I was in Iraq. I suddenly became this global reporter who found himself in war zones and disasters. And I started covering a lot of these stories all over the world, in part because I thought health was such a common denominator. And when you go into a natural disaster, when you go into a war zone where you may not understand the politics of a particular area, you may not understand the ideology, you may not even know how to identify it on a map, you do get health care. You understand when people are injured and how they should be taken care of in a situation like that. And I have found all over the world that there are people who have certain scientific beliefs, and sometimes those things collide with their superstition, their ideologues. You know, it's amazing. In this country, when you talk about vaccines and autism, in other countries, when you talk about natural products versus pharmaceuticals, I had a long conversation with former President Clinton about this. About a year ago, I got a call from him in my office, and he was talking to me about the fact that 2 of his friends had sons who had both died of prescription drug overdoses. It was the most amazing thing. I'd never heard him talk like this. He was really quite broken up about it, and shared with me some pretty stunning data. He'd already started to do his homework, and he had found that in this country, a person dies every 19 minutes of an accidental prescription drug overdose. It was remarkable. 80% of the world's pain pills were consumed right here in this country. 80%. And it was something that he very much wanted to talk about, so we decided to make a documentary where we created all the facts, and as former President Clinton does so well, provided some of the amazing stories to make this so relevant to people. So it was full circle for me. I learned about these things from them when I worked there in the late 90s, and even 15 years later, we're still being able to combine the really substantive data with the important stories that make people care about this. I have had a lot of stories myself over the last 12 years of doing this work, and one of the ones that I think has been most significant for me was when I covered the war in Iraq. And I was there as an embedded reporter. As Skip mentioned, I'd been there for a long time, covering a group of doctors and healthcare folks who are known as, colloquially, as the devil docs. These are naval doctors who were traveling with the Marines to basically try and provide them some care when they were injured. And what they learned in 1991 during the Gulf War, that it was simply taking too long to get the injured back to definitive medical care. So what they wanted to do 12 years later in 2003 was take these forward resuscitative units and move them further and further up the battlefield. And so taking these 6-man tents where they could perform surgery, take care of people, and put them basically in the middle of the battlefield. And that's what the devil docs were doing. And I was embedded with them for quite a while, several weeks. And one day we were in the middle of this Shamel sandstorm, which is a sandstorm where the sand is blowing in from the northeast, and it's so, there's so much sand that you have no air cover, you can barely do anything, you can't even really see your hand in front of your face. And it was on a day like that these men were outside on patrol, just outside of Baghdad, and one of the lieutenants took his helmet off for just a minute because it was so hot outside, and he was shot in the back of the head. It was a sniper, shot him right in the right back of the head, and the Marines went and examined him. They could not find a pulse, and as they euphemistically like to say, they cleaned up the area before they went back and got him and brought him to the Devil Dogs camp. So I was an embedded reporter at that point and the only neurosurgeon in the field, and they asked me if I would literally take off my journalist cap and put on my surgeon's cap and take a look at this man. When he came in, they found a very weak pulse. So we decided to do what we could. And we weren't really equipped to do brain surgery in the middle of the field, but I actually took a drill, this Black & Decker drill. I sterilized the bit, and I used that to actually perform a craniotomy, to remove the back of his head and take out some of the bullet fragments and, most importantly, the blood clot that was pushing on his brain. So there was nothing sterile in here, so after the operation was done, I took an IV bag and I opened it up and used that to basically create the outer layers of his brain. I wrapped him up, put him on a Black Hawk helicopter, and wasn't sure that I'd ever hear from him again. His name is Jesus Vidana. I eventually got back home, and it was a couple months later, and I get a call, Monday, San Diego area code, I'll never forget, and I answer the phone, and the guy says, "Is this Dr. Gupta? I think I have an update on one of your patients." I said, "I think you might have the wrong Dr. Gupta." As it turns out, there's quite a few of us. He said, "No, I think he goes, were you in Iraq? Did you operate on, you remember operating on Jesus Vidana?" And I said, "Who could forget operating on Jesus in the middle of the desert?" You know? And I didn't know what he was going to say. Like, I didn't know how Jesus had done, you know, what kind of state he'd be in. And he said, you know, he goes, "Jesus is, he's got a little left hand weakness, but he's doing really well otherwise. You should come see him sometime," which was great news. So I was in Southern California, and I decided to look up Jesus, and I went to his house. And I'd never seen him but beaten and battered on that desert floor. And I knocked on the door, and this big strapping Marine, Jesus, opens the door and gives me a hug, and we go inside. And I don't know, this is one of those things. You know, we started having this conversation that I think very few people ever get to have. And his mother comes out a little while later, and she's so sweet. She says, "Are you the guy that operated on my son?" And I said, "Yes, I am." And she takes my hands in hers and says, "Thank you." Then his dad came out a little bit later. Moms and dads can be very different. And he goes, "Are you the guy that operated on my son?" I said, "Yes, sir, I am." And he goes, "And you're a journalist?" He hadn't quite gotten the whole story there. But we started to have this amazing conversation. And it was amazing because I realized that despite all that had happened between father and son, they had never really talked about it. They had never talked about it. And I started to ask some questions just because I was curious. And his father said to me, he goes, "Look, when Jesus was going off to war, he said to me, 'I'm going to be fine. I'll be fine. Don't worry about me.'" They were out to dinner. They were sort of joking about it. He said, "I could be back in a couple of weeks. Who knows what's going to happen? I'll be fine. Don't worry about me. Only worry if a car pulls up to the front of the house and two guys in uniforms get out, then worry." But it was no one ever took that seriously. So his father's telling me the story, and he says one day he came out of his bedroom and he was in the living room, and the storm door to the house was open, just the screen door was shut. It was 7 o'clock in the morning, and he saw a car pull up to the front of the house and two guys in uniforms get out. And his father's a strapping guy, you know, I mean, you couldn't imagine a guy like him telling me the story that he was telling me with the tears that were coming out of his eyes. And he said that these guys came up to the front door and knocked, and they could see him because the screen door was the only thing between them, and he couldn't move. He couldn't go there and answer the door because the only thing he remembered about that conversation with Jesus before he left was this exact scenario. And eventually it was his mom that went and answered the door, and they found out that Jesus had been injured but was still alive. And I tell you that story in part because, you know, I got to nurture and foster this conversation that otherwise would not have been had. And I think it's a large part of what we continue to do in medicine and especially as a medical journalist. And in part, it's a lot of the same lessons that I think I learned from the Clintons more than 15 years ago. So I remember those lessons, I continue to embody them, and I'm delighted to be able to share some of them with you tonight. Thanks so much for having me. Appreciate it.
Thank you, Dr. Gupta. I'm Stephanie Street with the Clinton Foundation, and we are so grateful for you coming to Little Rock to share your tremendous stories with us. Dr. Gupta is now going to take a few questions from the audience, so I will call on you if you'll raise your hand. Yes, this gentleman here in the back. And please wait for the microphone.
You mentioned disaster assistance that you've done in your medical field. I'm working on a book right now about a family that helps a child cope with the fear of severe weather. What, from your experience, have you seen of like post-traumatic stress syndrome, and can you compare what you've seen in the Middle East and in the fighting there versus some of the damage that was done at Moore and Katrina and different severe weather events that happened?
Yeah, it's a great question. We spent a lot of time looking at the aftermath of these things, and I will preface by saying I think mental health in these situations often gets short shrift. I don't think it gets discussed nearly enough. A couple things I'll point out. I think there's a distinction. This is my anecdotal experience, but a distinction between adults and children. I think the experience can be more similar among children, whereas with adults, I think it more depends on circumstance and resources, and it can just be so different even in a situation like Moore, Oklahoma, where I was, versus covering the tsunami, for example, in South Asia back in 2004. I will say that there appears to be a pretty big distinction with regard to whether it's a natural disaster versus a war, versus when you're actually in a conflict. I think there's this notion that when people are somehow targeted and someone else is trying to kill them, as happens in conflict and wars, it's a much more psychologically devastating thing. Whereas with natural disasters, and we saw it most recently in Moore, it's devastating, but you also see a galvanization of people coming together to try and rebuild a community, and there's very much this sense that we're in it together and there's no one to blame for what happened here. So it lasts a long time. I think, we've been back to South Asia since the tsunami there, and even years later, you can get the sense that it really consumes a lot of the people there. I think it's the most defining thing in their lives. So I think there's a couple of predictive parameters. One very simple one we find is sleep. Actually being able to get a good night's sleep for kids in particular within the first day or two after some sort of devastating tragedy is so important. And you can almost draw reliably that good sleep with what their outcome is going to be with respect to mental illness. So, and then I think a lot of the other thing is actually the communities coming together to rebuild. As media folks, we call this period where there's a lot of media coverage the heroic period. It's where everyone's talking about them and thinking about them, and obviously there's a lot of television cameras and news reporters, but I think it's when that period dies down that it's toughest, because all of a sudden there's this idea that maybe they've been forgotten, which is part of the reason I love, for example, working at CNN, and after the earthquake in Haiti, we stayed for so long. We stayed for weeks and weeks after lots of other organizations left, even though there wasn't an incredible demand from a rating standpoint anymore. People really weren't watching that much, but we knew it was important to keep telling those stories, and to the extent that can help with their mental recovery, it can be very gratifying. So.
Yes, right here, please.
What impact do you feel that the Affordable Care Act is going to have on Medicaid and Medicare fraud in the United States?
I think it's a significant problem, Medicare and Medicaid fraud, Medicare fraud maybe even more so. I think that if you look at sort of the forced deficiencies of the system because of caps on growth with regard to these federal entitlements, while it doesn't overtly, I think, there are other fraud protection programs in place, but with regard to the Affordable Care Act in particular, I think those forced deficiencies may help root out some of the fraud. As things stand now, and it's subject to change, is that the amount of spending on federal entitlements really can't be more than GDP plus 0.5%. And that's going to be a much slower growth trajectory than we've had in years past, in the last 10 years past, for example. A lot of people say, well, that's $800 billion coming out of Medicare. It's not really. It's just that if you looked at how we were growing these federal entitlements and how we will now grow them based on these caps, there's about an $800 billion difference between those two numbers. but I think that that may root out fraud. There'll be greater incentives, I think, than ever to try and find where some of those fraudulent payments and bills are coming from.
Yes, here in the front row.
My question has to do with aging in a way, and the question is the intersection between brain physiology and psychology. We've read that it really helps as you age to exercise your brain by learning new things that are challenging that you never learned before. For example, if I, for example, tried to learn a new language like Hindi, and it
That's
would,
challenging. That's
yeah. Yeah. So my question to you is that, as a neurosurgeon, do you find that the things that we've been told about that are true? And if they are, what is the collective wisdom about why that turns out to be true?
Yeah, this is a huge area of research, as you might imagine, and it's become only more relevant, I think, if you look at the changing demographics in this country. So we're probably dedicating more. We have a National Institute on Aging, which looks at this. One of the headlines recently that you may have read was that the cognitive exercises, such as crossword puzzles, doing Sudoku, things like that, probably didn't confer as much benefit as we once thought. Whereas physical exercise, simply improving blood flow and decreasing inflammation in the brain, really seems to help. But your point is absolutely right, and that is that learning new tasks, I mentioned, for me, doing broadcast television was a new task, but learning a new language, taking up a new hobby, that does seem to make a big difference. And this idea that there's a natural decay in the way that our various parts of our brain are communicating to one another is probably not true. There probably isn't a natural decay. It is our decay. It is the fact that we don't use it as much as we used to. And this whole now 30-year sort of notion that the brain is this muscle, and if we don't use it, we lose it, that whole thing is now proving out to be true scientifically, not just anecdotally. I wrote a book called Chasing Life, where we talked a lot about aging, and I love telling the story of this guy who's a 90-year-old stockbroker, and he could do these complex transactions in his head that most people couldn't do, now, and people say, well, that's extraordinary that he can do that. And in fact, it's just the fact that he was using that part of his brain all the time. People who go to the grocery store, and they always take a list with them. I love lists. I use lists all the time. But lists make you dependent on something outside of your own native memory. So it becomes a question more of how much you're relying on convenience and not exercising your brain. And while we focus on learning the new language and stuff, it's a lot more the daily activities where we can constantly be sort of stressing our brain a little bit more. But this idea that we simply, the brain starts to decay naturally, I think is probably just not proving out to be true.
Two more questions. Yes, sir, right here in the middle.
U.S. spends more than any other developed country on healthcare. In your opinion, what is driving this cost, and how can it be controlled?
We need another lecture series for this. There's so many things that drive healthcare costs, and I think even the most ardent supporters of the Affordable Care Act will say, look, we're not sure that this is going to absolutely bring down costs. If you look at this, it could. I think one of the things that brings down costs ultimately is to make America a healthier nation. And that may sound overly reductionist or simplistic, but I think it's so true. A healthier nation would be a cheaper nation, but this is not how we think. All the incentives are toward treating diseases after they occur as opposed to prevention. Philosophically, prevention is a very difficult thing to prove. I'm going to say to you that if you do these things, nothing will happen. How do you convey that message in a way that's meaningful to people? They'd like to believe it, but how do they know that in fact it was those things that they did that led to this lack of disease? I think that, I mentioned the whole thing about prescription drugs, the fact that 80% of the drugs, pain pills in the world are consumed in the United States is a metaphor for how we overtreat, how we overprescribe, how we overtest, how we overdiagnose in general. I think that is a significant problem in the United States, and I think it's no question driving up our healthcare costs. How exactly we fix that, I think, is a more complicated answer. I think we recognize this, I think, at all levels, but how we get to the point where we're not so dependent on the technology, not so dependent on pulling out a prescription pad and writing a prescription, I think is more challenging, and it won't happen quickly. But my prediction is, as we become a healthier nation, these things will become a little bit more obvious, and maybe that will bring down some of these costs.
Our last question right over here.
I have a daughter who's type 1 diabetic, and she was diagnosed in kindergarten. She's now 19. And we've always said to her, you know, it's so important to take care of yourself because they might find a cure for diabetes in your lifetime. And I just wonder if you could speak to that. Do you think that that's true, or do you think it's really going to be all about better insulin delivery and glucose monitoring? Is it just crazy to think that?
No, I don't. And people who know me will tell you I'm not prone to hyperbole. But I've traveled all over the world looking at some of these questions. My father's a diabetic as well, so I've had a personal interest in this for a long time. I think that, you know, there's a few very promising areas with regard to a potential cure for diabetes. And by cure, you mean to create a situation where your body is now producing enough insulin to be able to prevent the hyperglycemic index from being as high as it is. Your daughter, I don't know if she has an insulin pump, but essentially it's a similar sort of thing. And I think if you look at some of the research that's happening around the world with regard to artificially populating the pancreas with stem cells, I think we've already proven that that can work. What we've not been able to prove yet is just how safe it is in the long term, not to create what are called adenomas, for example, a type of pancreatic tumor as a result of those stem cells being injected. You obviously want to prove that it is safe, you want to prove that it is effective, and then you want to prove that it's more effective or a better alternative than what already exists today. In my lifetime, in our lifetime, I think that we're going to see that. You know, maybe your daughter will be somebody who will be one of the beneficiaries of that, considering she's only 19 years old now. But yeah, I'm optimistic about that. I'm optimistic with regard to the promise of some of these stem cell therapies. I'm optimistic with regard to what are known as exogenous pancreas transplants even. That's been shown to work and been shown to be possible. We just got to make sure it can be done broadly and safely. So good luck to your daughter. So.
Thank you again, Dr. Gupta. And